The wind cut like sharp blades through the dark streets of New York that night. The rain, heavy and incessant, seemed to have no respite, turning the sidewalks into muddy streams. Among the pedestrians struggling to protect themselves under flimsy umbrellas and drenched coats, Jayden walked hurriedly. In his arms, he carried a worn wooden box full of fresh fish that he had sold at the market during the day. Despite his obvious thinness and tired countenance, his eyes shone with a determination rarely seen in boys his age. His bare feet were covered in mud, and every step was a reminder of the difficulties he faced on a daily basis. Jayden wasn't just any boy. He was a survivor. Since his mother had died, he had become the main breadwinner in the house, doing everything possible and impossible to look after his sick father, John. Each night, he returned home with what little money he could find, counting every penny to make sure his father had the medicine he needed. Lincoln Avenue was especially busy that night. The traffic seemed chaotic, with horns echoing and headlights cutting through the darkness. Jayden picked up his pace, dodging puddles and avoiding bumping into hurried pedestrians. He was almost across the street when a sharp sound cut through the air. A scream. It was the kind of scream that froze the blood, charged with pure fear. Jayden turned quickly and saw the scene. A blonde-haired girl who looked about his age was standing in the middle of the street, as still as a statue. Her gaze was fixed on the lights of a bus that was approaching at full speed. It was obvious that the driver hadn't seen her. Jayden felt his heart race. Everything around him seemed to slow down, except for his own instinct. Without a second thought, he dropped the box of fish on the ground. The sound of the fish falling onto the wet sidewalk barely registered in his mind. He ran with all the strength his small body would allow, ignoring the tiredness he had felt since dawn. The bus was only a few meters away from the girl. The driver finally realized the danger, but it was too late to brake. "Look out!" shouted Jayden as he stretched out his arms to grab her. At the last second, he managed to wrap his arms around the girl's waist and pull her backwards with force. They both fell to the sidewalk, rolling on the rough surface. The bus passed them in a deafening roar, so close that Jayden felt the displacement of air pull him briefly towards the street. For a moment, everything was silent except for the sound of the rain and Jayden's heavy breathing. He blinked, trying to process what had just happened. The girl was alive. He had done it. She was sobbing softly, her wet hair clinging to her face. Jayden watched her with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice shaking with exhaustion and relief. The girl nodded but was clearly in shock. Her skin was pale, and her eyes, as big and blue as the winter sky, were watery. Before she could say anything, the sound of hurried footsteps caught Jayden's attention. An elegantly dressed woman came running up. Her heels tapped the sidewalk hard, and her expensive coat was partially wet from the rain. It was clear that she didn't usually frequent this kind of neighborhood. There was something about her posture, the way she held her leather bag close to her body and looked around cautiously, that indicated she was out of her comfort zone. "Elena!" shouted the woman, her voice full of desperation. She knelt down beside the girl, pulling her into a tight embrace. The woman's delicate manicured hands trembled as she examined her daughter, checking every inch to make sure she was unharmed. Elena, still in shock, began to cry openly, burying her face in her mother's shoulder. "Are you all right?" "What happened?" asked the woman, although her attention was focused entirely on her daughter. It was then that she noticed Jayden. He was standing there, drenched from head to toe, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he tried to catch his breath. His dark eyes were fixed on the woman, but there was something about his tense shoulders and bent posture that indicated he was about to run. "Were you the one who saved my daughter?" the woman asked, getting up and walking over to him. The disbelief in her voice was palpable. Jayden shrugged, trying to look indifferent, although his breathing was still rapid. She was in the middle of the street. Someone had to do something. The woman looked at him for a moment, as if trying to understand the simplicity of his answer. Then she opened her leather handbag and took out a wallet. Without hesitation, she pulled out several $100 bills and held them out to Jayden. "Here, please take it. It's the least I can do to say thank you." Jayden looked at the money, but made no mention of taking it. He shook his head, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I don't want any money, ma'am," he said, his voice low but firm. My father is very ill. We can't afford his medicine. If you can help, it would be more than enough." Jayden's words seemed to cut Madison like a knife. It wasn't the kind of request she had expected to hear. He didn't want charity. He wanted help. For a moment she was speechless. Something about that boy moved her in a way she couldn't explain. "What's your father's name? Where do you live?" Madison asked, her voice softer now. Jayden hesitated but eventually answered. He knew he had no other choice. If this woman could really help, maybe there was hope for his father. "We live on Birch Street at the end of the alley," he said, pointing in the vague direction of home. Madison nodded, putting the money back in her purse. "I'm going over there. I want to see how I can help." She held out her hand to Jayden, but he didn't take it. Instead, he went back to where he had left his box of fish. Most of the fish were lost, dirty, or scattered on the sidewalk, but he picked up the few that were still intact. The care with which he put them back in the box caught Madison's eye. He carried that weight, literally and figuratively, with a dignity that was hard to ignore. As Madison followed Jayden down the street, trying to balance his umbrella against the strong wind, she couldn't help but wonder how such a young boy could be so brave. Little did she know that this encounter would not only change Jayden's life, but also her own. Madison Foster adjusted her umbrella against the rain that showed no signs of letting up as she followed Jayden through the narrow, poorly lit streets. Water dripped down the sides of her expensive coat, but she didn't seem to mind. The slim figure of the boy in front of her was all that occupied her mind. He walked in silence, balancing the box of fish carefully, as if each one was still precious, even though most of them were ruined. Jayden didn't look back. He was nervous. His shoulders showed it. He wasn't used to people as distinguished-looking as Madison in his world. The streets he knew were populated by exhausted workers, street traders, and sometimes people who had simply given up on life. Now an elegant woman, who clearly didn't belong there, was standing behind him, offering help. It made no sense to him. They turned a corner, and Madison finally saw where he lived. The alley was cramped and dark, with lamps flickering overhead. Makeshift houses lined up in uneven rows with walls made of old boards and rusty pieces of metal. The entrance to Jayden's shack was partially covered by a blue tarpaulin, tied with twine and stones to protect them from the rain. But even under the tarpaulin, drops of water dripped continuously. Madison felt a pang in her chest. She knew poverty in theory. She had treated patients in difficult conditions during her career, but being there, in that place, was different. It was a cruel reminder of how unfair the world could be. "This is it," said Jayden, finally looking back. He didn't look ashamed, but there was a kind of resignation in his voice, as if he was used to explaining his reality to strangers. "My father is inside." He held up the tarpaulin and went inside. Madison hesitated for a moment before following him. As soon as she entered, the smell hit her, a mixture of mold, damp, and old medicines. The interior was small and poorly lit, with only one light bulb hanging by a thread. There was a bed in the corner, where a middle-aged man lay, covered in a thin blanket. His face was pale, and the hoarse cough that echoed through the room denounced his critical state. "Dad, this is Dr. Madison Foster," announced Jayden, placing the fish box on the floor. "She said she wanted to help." John tried to get up, but the strength wouldn't come. He slowly leaned back against the wall, his eyes trying to focus on the woman who had just entered. Her voice was weak and hoarse, but there was a touch of warmth in it. Thank you for coming here. I don't know what my son said to you, but we're doing well enough. I don't want to disturb you." Madison approached, kneeling beside the bed. Her experienced eyes scanned John quickly, taking in details such as the color of his skin, the weariness in his eyes, and the sound of his breathing, which wheezed with every inhale. "You're not well," said Madison, with the authoritative calm she used in her profession. "That cough and your difficulty breathing indicate something serious. We need to get you to hospital." John shook his head, coughing again. "We can't afford this. I've already accepted the idea that there may not be much time. What matters now is that Jayden is okay." "Dad!" Jayden protested, his eyes blazing with indignation. He approached quickly, grabbing his father's hand. "Don't talk like that. Dr. Madison says she can help. Why don't you let her try?" Madison watched the boy, impressed by the passion in his voice. It was clear that Jayden didn't have much in life, but he had something that many had lost: hope. "Don't worry about the cost," she said, looking directly at John. "I'll take care of it. What matters now is that you get the treatment you need." John hesitated. He wasn't used to accepting help, especially from strangers, but something in Madison's tone made him give in. He nodded slowly, and Madison felt a momentary sense of relief. Meanwhile, Jayden began to organize the small house, as if to show Madison that they were decent people, even in the midst of poverty. He took the remaining fish and put them in an old bowl, then began to clean the damp floor with a cloth that already seemed to be at the limit of its usefulness. Madison watched the boy, feeling a mixture of admiration and sadness. He shouldn't have to carry so much weight at such a young age. When he had finished tidying up, she stood up. "Jayden, I need to ask you something. Are you going to school?" She knew the answer, but she wanted to hear him say it. He paused for a moment, looking at the floor. "No, ma'am. I work at the fair. That's what we need right now." Madison sighed, trying not to let her frustration show. "You're a smart kid, Jayden. You deserve a chance to study, to have a different future. I promise I'll find a solution." He didn't answer, but something in his eyes told her that he wanted to believe her, even if he didn't know how. That evening, Madison returned home with her mind full of thoughts. She had already decided that she would help Jayden and John, but the depth of their situation made her uneasy. For the first time in years, she felt she was facing something she couldn't solve with money alone. There was something deeper here, something that required more than just generosity. It required commitment. Meanwhile, in the small shack, Jayden sat next to his father. He held John's hand, feeling the cold, paper-thin skin. Despite all the pain and uncertainty, Jayden was determined to fight. Madison's visit had rekindled something inside him, the possibility that maybe, just maybe, things could change. The next morning arrived colder and grayer than the night before. The rain had subsided to a light drizzle, but the wind carried a biting cold that made his bones ache. Jayden, his eyes still heavy with fatigue, was helping his father, John, get ready to leave. John's old coat was worn out, with patches made by Jayden from scraps of cloth he had found. He shivered, but didn't complain. "Dad, you've got to try and eat something before we go," insisted Jayden, holding out a bowl of thin broth that he had prepared with the remains of the previous night's dinner. John shook his head, coughing, interrupting his attempt to reply. "Don't worry about me, son. I just want this to be over quickly. The sooner we get back, the better." Jayden looked away, pretending to be busy with something on the floor. He knew his father's words weren't just about the hospital. John had accepted a long time ago that his health was deteriorating. For him, every effort seemed to be a losing battle. The sound of a car pulling up in front of the shack caught both their attention. Jayden ran to the door and saw Madison's black sedan parked at the entrance to the alley. It was a stark contrast to the surrounding landscape, a reminder that she was from another world, a world Jayden could only see from afar. Madison got out of the car, wearing a heavy coat that looked new. She carried a serious but not stern expression, like someone who had important work to do. She looked at Jayden and then at John, who was trying to get out of the shack with the help of a cane. "Is everything ready?" she asked, with a tone that indicated she wasn't there to waste time. Jayden nodded, holding his father's arm as he helped him walk. John looked smaller under the weight of his illness, almost too frail to face the cold wind. Madison watched the scene with a lump in her throat. It wasn't just John's physical condition that worried her. It was the resigned silence of a man who seemed to be carrying not only his own pain, but also the responsibility of not being a burden to his son. New York Metropolitan Hospital was an imposing building with glass walls that reflected the grey sky. Inside, the lobby was large and bright, with marble floors and an impeccable reception desk. Jayden had never been to a place like this before. He held his father's arm as he looked around, uncomfortable with the luxury and efficiency that seemed to suffocate the atmosphere. The people around were well-dressed, busy with their own problems. None of them seemed to notice the boy in shabby clothes and still slightly dirty feet walking beside his sick father. "Come on, I've prepared everything," said Madison, leading them to the elevator. John hesitated as he passed the reception desk, as if he expected someone to stop him at any moment. When they finally got into the elevator, he looked at Madison. "I really don't know how to thank you for this, Doctor. I don't know what we did to deserve such kindness." Madison shook her head, smiling slightly. "It's not about deserving, John. It's about doing the right thing. You need help, and that's what I'm here for." When they reached the floor of the medical ward, a team was already waiting. Nurses took John to do the initial tests, leaving Madison and Jayden alone in the corridor. The silence between them was palpable. "Is he going to be okay?" Jayden asked, finally breaking the silence. Madison looked at him, seeing something in his eyes that reminded her of the most difficult patients she had ever treated. Hope mixed with fear. She knew she couldn't promise anything. "We'll do our best. He's in good hands now." Jayden nodded, but the weight of uncertainty seemed to bend his shoulders. He stood in the corridor, staring at the door through which his father had disappeared, as if he could protect him even from a distance. While John underwent tests and began treatment, Madison began to work on another promise she had made, to change Jayden's life. The connection she felt with this boy went beyond simple professional duty. He reminded her of something she herself had lost a long time ago, a sense of purpose, of direct impact. After a few calls and meetings, Madison managed to secure a full scholarship for Jayden at Hamilton Academy, one of the most prestigious schools in the city. It was a place that trained leaders, but rarely made room for someone from Jayden's background. When Madison told him the news, he was incredulous. "Me? Study there? That's a joke, isn't it?" "No, Jayden," replied Madison with a reassuring smile. "You deserve this opportunity. You're a smart and determined kid. I believe in you." He remained silent, processing the words. But the fear of not fitting in was evident in his eyes. "These kids, they're not like me. They'll realize that I don't belong here." "Jayden," said Madison, kneeling down so that she was at his height, "the only difference between you and them is that you had to grow up earlier. That makes you stronger, not less. And believe me, you'll find your place." Despite Madison's words, Jayden's first day at Hamilton Academy was a nightmare. He entered the school wearing the uniform Madison had bought for him, but that didn't erase the discomfort of being surrounded by children from wealthy families who walked around with expensive backpacks and state-of-the-art cell phones. At break time, he heard whispering and laughter as he passed through the corridor. Some students looked at him with curiosity, others with veiled contempt. He tried to remain invisible, but it was impossible. He was different, and everyone knew it. That's when Alina, Madison's daughter, found him. She had heard of the boy who had saved her life, but she still didn't know what to think of him. When she saw him sitting alone in the cafeteria, she decided to approach him. "Hi, Jayden," she said with a hesitant smile. "Can I sit here?" He looked at her, surprised. For a moment, he thought it was some kind of joke, but her smile seemed genuine, and he shrugged. Of course. It was the start of a friendship that would change both their lives. Despite their obvious differences, Elena saw something in Jayden that the others didn't: his strength, his resilience. Over time, other students began to see it too. John's treatment began intensely. During his first few days at the Metropolitan Hospital, he underwent a battery of tests and medical procedures that seemed endless. Each new machine and each consultation with a specialist made John feel smaller, as if he were being swallowed up by a system much bigger than him. Despite this, there was something comforting in knowing that he was receiving first-rate medical attention, something he had never imagined possible. Jayden visited the hospital every day after school. He would arrive carrying a small bag of fruit or the broth he could prepare at home. The journey there was a long one, 2 buses and a 15-minute walk. He did it without complaint, but Madison noticed the growing tiredness in the boy. "Jayden, you don't have to come every day," she said in a gentle tone after finding him sitting next to John's bed, his eyes half closed with sleep. "Your father is in good hands here." Jayden shook his head, rubbing his eyes. "He needs to know he's not alone. It's what my mother always said, no one should face things alone." Madison felt a squeeze in her heart when she heard this. She had never asked about Jayden's mother, but now she realized that her absence was an important piece in the family puzzle. It was as if he carried her memory in every decision he made. While John received intensive care, Jayden continued his difficult adjustment to Hamilton Academy. Despite Elena's efforts to integrate him, the prejudice of many students was still evident. The muffled laughter and whispering didn't stop, and on some occasions, Jayden even found anonymous notes left in his locker with cruel messages. "You don't belong here. Go back to the alley you came from." Jayden tried to ignore it. He knew he couldn't afford to be weak. But one particularly difficult afternoon, after a math class in which the teacher had praised his performance, something that clearly upset some students, he was confronted in the hallway by a group of older boys. "Hey, fairground boy," said one of them, blocking Jayden's way, "do you think you're smarter than us just because you know how to solve equations?" Jayden tried to get past them, but another boy pushed his shoulder. "I don't want any trouble," he said, keeping his voice firm but low. "Confusion?" laughed the leader of the group. "You're the mess, Jayden. People like you shouldn't be here." Before anything worse could happen, a clear voice cut through the air. "Leave him alone." It was Elena. She came in like a storm, her face flushed with anger. The boys hesitated but laughed before walking away. "Elena, are you defending him?" one of them teased. "I thought you had more sense. Common sense," she retorted. "I think you should try it. It might do you good." They left, muttering bitter comments. Elena turned to Jayden, who was standing there, his fists clenched at his sides. "Are you all right?" she asked. He nodded, but his expression said something else. "Why did you do that?" he asked, his voice laden with something that sounded more like shame than gratitude. "Because they were wrong," Elena replied, crossing her arms, "and because you don't deserve to be treated like this." He didn't answer, but there was a glimmer of something in his eyes, perhaps admiration, perhaps gratitude. At that moment, Jayden realized that despite all the obstacles, he wasn't completely alone. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Madison immersed herself in John's story during her daily visits. They talked at length while he was in hospital, and it was during one of these conversations that she heard something that triggered a strange feeling. "When we were little, my sister and I were inseparable," John said, his voice low as he looked out the window of the hospital room. "But our family, well, things didn't work out. My parents lost everything. My sister was put up for adoption. I never saw her again. Madison frowned, feeling a chill run down her spine. How old was she when that happened? She asked. John sighed. About 5, maybe 6. I was 8. She was small, but already stubborn as a mule. She always said she was going to become someone important. I don't know what happened to her, but sometimes I still think about her. Madison was silent for a moment, trying to process his words. There was something familiar about the story. Very familiar. But she didn't want to jump the gun. What was her name? She finally asked, trying to sound casual. Madison, replied John, smiling sadly. Maddie, I called her. Madison's heart raced. The connection was impossible to ignore. She herself had been adopted at the age of 5 and had vague memories of an older brother, someone who used to call her Maddie. But it could just be a coincidence, right? It didn't make sense that fate would bring them together in such an unlikely way. Even so, she knew she wouldn't be able to rest without answers. That same afternoon, after leaving the hospital, Madison made a call to a genetic testing laboratory she had worked with before. She obtained DNA samples from John under the pretext of checking for genetic predispositions related to his health condition. After handing over the material, she stared at the envelope with trembling hands. What if it's true? She whispered to herself. The next few days were anxious, waiting for Madison. She continued to follow John's treatment and Jayden's adjustment closely, but the possibility that John could be her lost brother never left her mind. On the other hand, she wondered how it would change things. Would they accept the truth? What were the chances that their lives were so intertwined? Meanwhile, Jayden began to excel at school, despite his social difficulties. He had a natural talent for math and science, and his determination caught the attention of teachers and classmates who had previously ignored him. Elena remained by his side, encouraging him and sometimes defending him. However, Jayden sensed that something was changing in Madison. There was a subtle detachment about her, as if she was always distracted. He noticed it, but didn't know how to ask. He could only hope it wasn't something bad. One day, Madison received a phone call from the laboratory. The test results were ready. Her hands trembled as she opened the envelope and read the words that confirmed her suspicions. John was her biological brother. The emotion hit her like a wave, and tears began to stream down her face. "It's him," she whispered. "He's my brother." Madison knew she had to tell him the truth, but how? And when? The revelation would have to be made carefully because it would change all their lives forever. The hospital corridor was silent that afternoon. It was a contrast to the usual chaos of nurses rushing to attend to patients and doctors discussing medical records. Madison Foster walked slowly towards John's room, feeling the weight of the envelope she carried in her bag. The results of the DNA test burned like fire in her hands. She knew what was written on it, but what scared her most was John and Jayden's reaction. Inside the room, John was sitting up in his hospital bed with a slightly healthier expression. The intensive treatment was working, and he could speak more easily, although he still tired quickly. Next to him, Jayden was sitting in a chair, his elbows resting on his knees and his gaze fixed on a math book that Madison had bought for him. When Madison entered the room, they both looked up. Jayden smiled, as he did every time he saw her. Despite his initial distrust, he had begun to trust her. For him, Madison was more than a doctor. She was someone who had given his family hope. "Dr. Madison," John greeted with a faint smile, "it looks like you have some good news, doesn't it?" Madison hesitated. She wasn't a woman who usually felt afraid. In the operating room, she was known for her precision and calm under pressure. But there, in that hospital room, she felt vulnerable. What she was about to say could change everything. She closed the door behind her and put the envelope on the table next to the bed. Taking a deep breath, she sat down in the chair next to Jayden. Her heart was racing, but her voice sounded firm. "John, Jayden," she began, looking from one to the other. "I have something important to tell you, something that might be a little hard to believe." John frowned, leaning forward slightly. "What is it, Doctor?" Madison took the envelope, opened it and took out the sheet of paper with the results of the DNA test. She looked at the document for a moment before meeting John's eyes. "John, I asked you to do a DNA test. It was my initiative because something in your story seemed very familiar. The result confirmed what I already suspected." She paused, trying to find the right words. "You're my brother." The silence that followed was heavy. John blinked, as if trying to process what he had just heard. Jayden looked at Madison, confused, as if waiting for her to explain further. The room seemed smaller, as if the air had been sucked out. "What?" John finally asked. His voice was almost a whisper. How is that possible?" Madison smiled slightly, but her eyes were watery. "I was adopted when I was 5. I always knew I had a brother, but I never knew what happened to him. When you told me about your childhood and about Maddie, everything fell into place. I knew I needed to confirm it." John leaned back on the bed, putting a hand to his forehead. He looked stunned, as if the information was too big to process. "Maddie, I always wondered where you were. I always wanted to know if you were okay, if you'd been happy." "I was fine," said Madison, her voice low. "I had a comfortable life. My adoptive parents gave me everything I needed. But I always felt that something was missing. I always felt that there was a part of me that I couldn't reach." Jayden looked from one to the other, still trying to understand. "So, you're my aunt?" Madison laughed softly, wiping away a tear that was running down her cheek. "Yes, Jayden. I'm your aunt." Emotion takes over. John started to laugh softly, but his laughter soon turned to tears. He covered his face with his hands and his voice came out broken. "I never thought I'd see you again. I never thought fate could do something like this." Madison held his hand, squeezing it tightly. "I never imagined it either, John. But I'm here now. We're together again." Jayden watched everything, not sure how to react. Part of him was thrilled to see his father so vulnerable, so happy. Another part was wary. What did this mean for them? Their life was complicated enough. Madison seemed like a blessing, but what if she decided to leave one day? He didn't know if he could handle any more losses. Madison noticed the hesitation in Jayden's gaze and approached him. "Jayden, I know this is a lot to take in, but I want you to know that I'm here for you. I'm not going anywhere. I promise I'll do everything I can to help you and your father." Jayden nodded slowly. He wanted to believe her. Maybe, for the first time, he had a real chance of having a family again. Over the next few days, the dynamic between them began to change. John, now more stable thanks to the treatment, began to talk to Madison at length, recalling childhood stories that she had forgotten. They laughed, cried, and reconnected in ways that seemed miraculous. Jayden, for his part, began to feel the weight of his responsibility lessen. He still visited the hospital, but now he could concentrate more on school, knowing that his father was being looked after. He began to excel even more, especially in math, and his friendship with Elena deepened. Madison, however, knew that her journey was only just beginning. She had to balance her life as a doctor, a newfound aunt, and a sister. But for the first time in a long time, she felt she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The cold wind of winter began to give way to the freshness of spring. The streets of New York, once grey and covered in dirty snow, began to bloom with life. It was as if their surroundings reflected the change taking place in the lives of Jayden, John, and Madison. John, now recovered enough to leave hospital, was beginning to readapt to life outside of bed. Although his health still required constant care, there was a sparkle in his eyes that Jayden hadn't seen for years. He moved around more confidently, supported by a cane and the constant supervision of Madison, who seemed to take on the role of big sister and caregiver with ease. "I never thought I'd get out of that hospital," confessed John, sitting on the sofa in the new home Madison had arranged for them. "But here I am. The house wasn't big, but it was clean, organized, and above all safe. Located in a simple but quiet neighborhood, it was a world of difference from the shack where they had lived before. Jayden had his own room for the first time in his life, and although he was still getting used to the comfort, he loved the feeling of privacy. At Hamilton Academy, Jayden began to find his rhythm. The first few months had been difficult, but his determination and intelligence eventually won over not only his teachers, but also some of his classmates. Elena remained his biggest supporter, and his friendship with her helped him navigate the school's complicated social environment. However, not everything was perfect. There were times when Jayden still felt out of place. During a history lesson, for example, the teacher asked the students where their families were during the Industrial Revolution, encouraging them to share personal stories. While other students talked about ancestors who built empires or took part in historical movements, Jayden remained silent. "What about you, Jayden?" asked the teacher. Jayden hesitated, feeling the curious stares of his classmates. "I don't know much about my family," he admitted. "All I know is that it's more recent." There was some muffled laughter, but Jayden didn't let it get to him. He knew that his story was unique, even if it didn't fit the school's standards. After class, Elena met Jayden in the corridor. "They don't understand," she said, shrugging. "And you know what? It doesn't matter. What matters is that you're here, building your own story." Jayden smiled. He had never thought of it like that before. For the first time, he felt he had a right to be there, regardless of what anyone else thought. As Jayden adjusted to school, John and Madison began to confront issues that had been buried for decades. One sunny afternoon, while Jayden was at school, the two of them sat in the small living room of their new home, drinking coffee and reminiscing about the past. "Did you know that I thought about you every day?" John asked, looking at the cup in his hands. "When you left, it was as if a part of me had been torn away." "I thought about you too," replied Madison, her voice soft. "But over time, the memories began to fade. I didn't want them to disappear, but they became weaker." There was a long silence before John spoke again. "Do you think our parents would be proud of us?" Madison blinked, surprised by the question. "I think so. We've been through a lot, John. But we're here, together, and we're looking after each other. I think that's all they would have asked for." John nodded, but his eyes were watery. "I just wish they'd had the chance to see you grow up. To see what you've become." Madison held his hand. "They're not here, but you are. And in a way, that's enough for me." As the months passed, Jayden began to realize the impact his new life was having on him. Before, his world was limited to the fair, the shack, and the hospital. Now, he saw possibilities he had never imagined. One Saturday morning, Madison took him to visit Columbia University. It was a casual outing, but Jayden knew she had something in mind. They walked around the campus, looking at the imposing buildings and the groups of students spread out on the lawns. "Do you imagine yourself here one day?" Madison asked as they stopped in front of a monumental library. Jayden looked at her, surprised. "Me? Studying here? I don't know if I'm good enough." Madison laughed, putting a hand on his shoulder. "Jayden, you're more than good enough. You just have to believe it." He looked at the library again, wondering what it would be like to go to a place like that. For the first time, he felt that maybe, just maybe, it was possible. The following evening, Madison organized a special dinner at their house. It was simple: pasta, salad, and a cake she'd bought from a local bakery, but the meaning was profound. John, still recovering, sat at the head of the table, while Jayden and Elena shared jokes and school stories. When dinner was over, John raised his glass of juice. "I want to say something." Everyone looked at him. He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "For years, I thought I was alone. I had Jayden, of course, but I always felt that something was missing. And now, with Madison back in my life, I realized that I was never really alone. We always had each other, even if we didn't know it." Madison smiled, holding John's hand. "We're here now, and that's what matters." Jayden watched the scene, feeling a wave of emotion he couldn't describe. He didn't know if life would be perfect from that moment on. It probably wouldn't be, but for the first time, he felt like he had something he'd always wanted, a place where he belonged.